Be known to us in the woundedness of this world. Make us witnesses to your love and truth. And be with your people until justice covers the earth and all is at peace. One of the most peculiar things about Luke's resurrection story is the way Jesus identifies himself to his friends. Look at my hands and my feet, he says to his frightened, doubtful disciples. They are shaking in their sandals. They are wondering if they are having a group hallucination when he offers them 4 sure proofs that he is who they think he is. 2 hands and 2 feet, 10 fingers and 10 toes, which could belong to no one else but him. It is the wounds he wants them to see. But isn't it a peculiar way to identify himself? Why not say, listen to my voice, or look at my face? Hands and feet are simply not the first things we notice about one another. And yet, I believe they can say so much about who we are. Hands reveal freckles, scars, wrinkles, misshapen joints, all of which hold stories about journeys, relationships, lived experiences. Feet are more private for some reason, perhaps because we have acquired the habit of wearing shoes in public. Maybe if we all wore sandals and washed each other's feet as our ancestors did, we would know more about what is hidden beneath the coverings of those shoes. As it is, though, we know a lot more about each other by our hands. What I like about hands is that they do not lie. They can't. We can usually exercise some control over our faces so that they look the way we want them to look. But our hands give us away every time. Nervous hands, clenched hands, damp hands, soiled hands. I love those Sherlock Holmes stories where some unsuspecting soul is introduced to Holmes, spends about 5 minutes in his presence and leaves the room. Then the great detective turns to Watson and tells him what the visitor does for a living, her family status, income level, and hobbies, all based on having shaken her hand. Look at my hands and my feet, Jesus said. It is the wounds he wants them and us to see. As we prepare to celebrate Earth Day this upcoming week, we would do well to get close to and see the woundedness of Mother Earth and all her creatures. We would do well to examine intently the atrocities we have perpetrated against this fragile earth, our island home, and the atrocities we have inflicted on our human family through environmental racism. We are reeling from a year that has laid bare the unjust and inequitable systems enabled by a history of structural and environmental racism. With the advent of a global pandemic, vulnerable communities at the intersections of these unjust systems doubly affected by histories of environmental racism and subsequent health vulnerability, remain disproportionately affected by COVID-19. The effects of residential segregation within the United States sees the concentration of people of color in disempowered neighborhoods exposed to toxins in the air, soil, and drinking water that put them at a higher chance of impaired heart and lung function, leaving them highly vulnerable to COVID-19. Similarly, communities in East Africa find themselves affected by hunger and malnutrition due in part to COVID-19 restrictions and crop failures from flooding and locusts due to climate change. The suffering is great indeed, and as we bear witness, we are also called as lovers of all of God's creation to speed the coming of the reign of God, looking and working toward a new heaven and a new earth. How do we, as people of faith, get beyond disbelief and come to terms with the reality of this suffering? How do we get in touch with the destruction of creation caused by climate change, plastic pollution, food apartheids, and toxic drinking water, which disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous people of color? I am reminded of Audre Lorde's words. I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are different from my own. Where suffering and injustice meet, compassion, justice, and freedom must be proclaimed and enacted with power. We are called to live and give our lives to exposing and excising the roots of suffering and injustice, even and especially in the perilous space of complex divisions and hatred of our time. That we heed this call is born from our hope in God's promise for a new world where righteousness is at home. With this hope, we rise above cynicism and refuse to conform to dominant patterns of injustice and disregard for people and planet. God goes with us when we strive to see the wounds, seek to heal our earth, liberate all who are oppressed, and bring wholeness and balance to our world. Look at my hands and my feet, Jesus said. And when they did, they saw everything he had ever been to them. They saw the hands that had broken bread and blessed broiled fish, holding it out to them over and over again. They saw the hands that had pressed pads of mud against a blind man's eyes and taken a dead girl by the hand so that she rose and walked. They saw the hands that danced through the air when he taught, the same hands that reached out to touch a leper without pausing or holding back. And his feet, the ones that had carried him hundreds of miles, taking his good news to all who were starving for it, into the homes of criminals and corrupt bureaucrats whom he treated like long-lost kin, into the graveyard where the Gerasene demoniac lived like a wild dog among the dead, whom he freed from his devils forever. Looking at those feet, they remembered the uncouth woman who had wet them with her tears and dried them with her hair, and Mary, who had sat at his feet, quietly absorbing every word he spoke, while her sister Martha railed at her to get up and work. They were wounded now, all of them. The hands that had joined him to other people, and the feet that had joined him to the earth. They had holes in them, sore, angry-looking bruises that hurt them to look at. Only it was important for the disciples to look because they had never done it before. Earlier, when they had figured out what was coming to those beloved hands and feet, they had fled, hiding themselves away where they could not see the bleeding nor hear the pounding of the hammers. Look, he said to them afterward, when the danger was past. You can look at them now. He wanted them to know he had gone through the danger and not around it. So he told them to look not at his face, not into his eyes, but at his hands and feet, which told the truth about what had happened to him, which were the only proof he had that he was who he said he was. Some of us wish he had come back all cleaned up, but he did not. He left us something to recognize him by, his hands and feet, just like ours, or almost like ours. You know what his said about him. What do ours say about us? Where have they been? Whom have they touched? How have they served? What have they proclaimed? Before they accepted Jesus' call to proclaim the gospel message to all nations and live out its demands, the early disciples needed to have the experience of being close witnesses. The risen Jesus appeared to the disciples and showed them his wounds, ate with them, and then sent them out. We too need to witness closely before we answer God's call. COVID-19 has given us a dramatic overview of racism, health inequity, and economic disparity. It has shown us how fragile and interconnected our society really is. Seeing the wounds of our society from afar, however, is not enough to inspire us to take action. As we come closer to the people and other parts of earth that are suffering the most, as we touch the world suffering within ourselves, we grow closer to God's purpose and calling, closer to becoming God's hands and feet in the world. You are witnesses of these things, Jesus told the disciples before he left them, entrusting the world to their care. When that world looks around for the risen Christ, when they want to know what that means, it is us they look at. Not our pretty faces and not our sincere eyes, but our hands and feet. What we have done with them and where we have gone with them. We are witnesses of these things. We still are the body of Christ.